Hi, this is Swapnil Bharti and welcome to TFR Insights, a show where we deep dive into emerging technologies. And today we have with us once again Dan Garfield, now Chief Open Source Officer at Codefresh. Dan, it's great to have you back on the show in your new capacity.
Thank you. Excited to be here and have a new mission.
If you look at Codefresh, you folks already do a lot of open source. So, what was the strategic need to create this role and put you in this role?
Yeah, so I think that in Codefresh, in the last few years, we've had a strategy that was build our product and contribute some of those things to open source. So we've had a lot of open source components. And so it's really been kind of product first, open source second. And what we really want to do now going forward is reverse that. We want to be open source at the core and then build, some things on top of that. And so that's a really big strategic shift for us because we look at the different components that we have within our product that we think are actually really valuable. We want to find ways that we could potentially give those things to the community. And instead of kind of building on a closed base, we want to build on an open base and then add value on top of it. So it's really a complete reversal of kind of our engineering and product strategy to be built on open source instead of having some open source components that we contribute to. So it's really bringing it to the core of our business.
As I said earlier, that Codefresh has been involved with open source, but creating this position, does it kind of further enforces your commitment to open source, or does it help the company to navigate? Because open source is challenging. You have to worry about legal issues, you have to worry about licensing issues, you have to worry about community, you have to also worry about not only your users, you have to also worry about your competitors who are also engaged in the open source world. So there's a lot of politics also involved in the open source world. So talk about I'm going back to the original question, that is that what was the strategic importance of creating this role there?
Yeah, so you're right. There are a lot of gymnastics involved. And, as part of my role as the chief technology evangelist, my previous role, I was doing a lot of community engagement kind of work. And I was often working as the sort of the liaison into some of the open source projects that we were engaged with. But now that we are kind of refocusing the company around open source and having open source instead be the foundation, those things that used to be okay to do as a part of a role have become much more all-consuming. And so, like within my team, we're focused on not just, okay, how do we tell the Codefresh story, but also like we're developing these standards around Gitops with the community. How do we get that message out? How do we make sure that it's easy for people to adopt? How do we make sure that people are engaged in that? And so there's both an engagement with open source projects as well as evangelizing open source projects and building out the standards that are going to power not only our open source technology, but hopefully many other standards, many other companies that are going to adopt those as well.
I wanted to ask this question to you is that today every company, you have to be a software company if you want to survive into this world. And of course, if you're a software company, you are touching cloud and you are touching open source. You may not be a very active contributor to open source, but you are consuming open source in a great capacity. Which can become challenging. Sometimes small companies, when they start off, they start using open source, but they really don't know how to engage with that. At some point, they grow bigger and bigger, or they become a target for acquisition. Now, suddenly, a lot of challenges occur because they did not even know. They may create a lot of technical debt. They might be risking a lot of their own IP because they use the license. So, can you talk about the importance of having not only a open source officer, but also having an open source strategy as core part of your business model itself?
Yeah, I mean, it goes both ways. So starting with the customer, if you're going to adopt an open source project and you're going to start using that open source technology, oftentimes it's because there's a simple problem you want to solve. And so you can plug in this open source technology to solve that problem. Now, as you grow and as you scale out, you're going to find that there are unforeseen problems, there are unforeseen challenges. So companies, when they adopt open source technology, they really like to have a potential sponsor of that project that they can go to say, okay, now we're taking this to scale. What's the right way to do this? Are there some tools that can help me do this at an enterprise level? Is there someone we can talk to? Is there someone we can get support from? So having that available is actually really important to help push and make available open source and make it usable for people, because they know that those safety mechanisms and those scale components are going to be there. Now, for people that are selling software, um, if you're building software that is meant for your customers to use, and you're doing it in a completely proprietary way, um, what you're doing is really cutting off the free adoption at the legs. So if you have open source technology that you're building on, that you're providing value on top of, then that community is one that you can become part of. You can become part of that community and you can build on the value that's there. And as those people grow, they're going to help you grow. And as you grow, you can invest more back into the open source that helps grow the community. So it's really valuable because there's so many people that can adopt these open source tools at a small level, who are looking for the pathway for where they go as it expands and scales. So it's a really symbiotic relationship between companies that want to build open source software and the communities that adopt and push and help build that open source software too.
How does it impact? Because we are talking about customers that in most cases, these customers are working with company like Codefresh or any other vendor. Is they want to consume that open source, solution, but they want a vendor to take care of a lot of, unnecessary challenge or complexity that come with it. Does that affect the decision of that company that, hey, how invested you are into that open source project or community? How is your reputation within that project itself? You may be just a leecher, you don't even contribute. So they may not want to work with a company who doesn't have very good. So does that having a very clear, very visible, very transparent open source strategy help building confidence within your customer base also?
Yeah, I think so, but it always has to come with real contributions. And so part of my role is external, it's working with these communities, but part of it is internal, just working with our engineers to be constantly pushing for, okay, what about this component? Can we contribute this back upstream? Can we make this part of the project? So a lot of it is external and internal, because ultimately the proof is in the pudding. If you don't contribute the code, then people don't care. You're just there for the fun and for the show. So getting really engaged with making more contributions, being more engaged in that's really critical, not only for building credibility, but also for the longevity and survivability of the product. If you're relying on someone else to build the entire open source roadmap and then contribute all the code, you're not participating. Your hand's not on the wheel with them. It's not a community effort. You're just trying to capitalize on a community that exists. So it has to be symbiotic. It has to be beneficial for both. And if it's not, then it's not going to work. It's not going to work at all.
One of the focus areas in your previous role was Gitops. You did a lot of work in there. So let's talk about, first of all, to just reiterate, just to remind our viewers, what is Gitops and how it's playing a critical role in Codefresh's strategy?
Yeah, Gitops is really a fresh take on a lot of classic ideas. So infrastructure as code, Git defined version control for all of that infrastructure as code, reconciliation with what's in production versus what's in your code base. So these ideas have been around for a long time. What's unique about Gitops is how they all come together and become really straightforward and streamlined. There were people that were doing hardcore infrastructure as code with Git defined infrastructure, and they were doing reconciliation 10 years ago. But 10 years ago, that was really a complex, really difficult thing to pull off. The tools weren't really mature. There was some tooling, but you had to do a lot of glue. So with Gitops, a lot of the work is focused around, let's build a standard for how that process should work. So we know we're going to use some kind of immutable storage. It could be Git, it could be SVN, it could be whatever. But typically it's Git. That's hence the name Gitops, right? We're going to use reconcilers that are constantly looking for updates and then pulling and reconciling those changes onto production. And so this also helps with drift detection and things like that. Now, mostly GitOps right now is focused in Kubernetes, but that's not necessarily part of the definition. You could very easily see other technologies lended to this as long as you have the reconcilers that you can use to support it. But basically, you have an operator sitting on your Kubernetes cluster that is looking for changes to your main branch, your master branch. And as it sees those changes, it's applying those changes to production. And if production gets modified, you can actually have it go back to that source of truth to reconcile. Now, there are a lot of problems that a lot of challenges that come along with doing this at scale. This is something that we're working on very heavily. So at the core of it, it's let's build a standard that many tools can comply with, and let's build a really clear, defined way to implement this so that people can do it easily and accessibly. It's not going to be something that you need, a 300 IQ and 50 people to implement. We want it to be a core set of tools that are really simple to implement, that allow you to get there and actually be operating GitOps in your company, because you get auditability, you get code reliability, you get insight into what's happening, bringing all that stuff and making it super clear. It's actually really critical to do now in a microservice world, because if you're deploying 1,000 microservices and you're updating them all 4 or 5 times a day, if you have a service degradation over here, you don't know where that originated from. It could actually be caused from an update in a totally different microservice, right? So having a way to bring all of this together and expose all of the data so that if you do have a service degradation, you can very quickly draw a line around which deployments could be responsible. And you can see, here's what Jira issues were being worked on. Here's what code was changed. Here's who was working on it. All of that gives you the tools that you need to prevent downtime, to get rid of service degradation, and to have a lot more confidence in your deployments, which ultimately allows you to deploy much more often. So it's really key to developer velocity. So that's a very long-winded answer, and I can't even remember where we started.
No, that explains a lot of things. And one thing more that we are seeing is a trend is towards SREs, or site reliability engineers, because it's seen in some cases as evolution of the whole DevOps paradigm. So talk about where does GitOps and SRE merge, or how do you see the evolution? Because these when we talk about whether GitOps, when we talk about SREs, they're not thing in itself. They're more or less like how we do stuff, right? So talk a bit about what are you seeing in the space, especially with this pandemic. Every company is rushing towards digital transformation. Every company is rushing towards cloud computing. At the same time, there's a huge gap between demand and supply of talented engineers. Sometimes we are pushing for low code, or in some cases, no code as well. So talk about when we consider all of that, and then where do you see GitOps, SREs? They are driving this movement, helping companies. Because developers should not have to worry too much about the tool. They should have to worry about the business value.
Yeah. They should be focused on writing code that is going to provide business value, not on how they deliver that code. I mean, we should make that really simple, right? So this whole thing really starts off being centered, going back a few years, everything was centered on pipelines, right? And so every software change, you would design a bespoke and special pipeline that would build the code, it would package it, it would test it, and it would deploy it. And this is a traditional kind of view of CI/CD. It's called CI/CD, even though it's really just pipelines, right? As we get into GitOps, what we're really talking about is taking CD and moving it to its own distinct entity that is very separate from pipelines. What do I mean by that? Well, pipelines are about going through a process, and it could be bespoke or it could be templated or whatever. But typically, they've been very bespoke. It's been like a craftsman has been doing this. This is where the DevOps people have been really focused, is like building these robust pipelines for each service. And that worked great when you were on a monolithic system. You had one service to update. But now you have 2,000. So does that mean I need to have 2,000 different pipelines? Well, ideally, no. Ideally, no, because that's really hard to build and maintain, and those things are brittle and they break all the time, right? Pipelines are not they're ill suited to be the mechanism of continuous delivery. So with GitOps, what we're saying is when something is merged into main or master or whatever naming scheme you're using, that is something that should be deployed. So we're already enforcing a difference in Git flow because the way that a lot of people have worked in the past is everything that goes into main, maybe we build it, maybe we release it, but we don't have to. We cut a release from main, and that's what gets deployed, right? But with GitOps, you actually create a distinction there. You say if it's in main, then it needs to be deployed. So what you need to do is actually you create separate repositories. So as you're building code, you have your application repo where your changes are going into. And once they're merged into main, or maybe somebody opens a pull request, this triggers a CI process that tests those changes and also will then kick off a process, and this is typically a pipeline as well, to generate the manifests for what should be deployed into production. And then that is packaged automatically, typically, and a pull request is opened on an infrastructure repo. So you have your application repo and your infrastructure repo. Your infrastructure repo, then as a pull request is open, we go through our testing phases and everything to make sure it's okay. And then once it's merged, your CD operators are looking and saying, hey, there's an update. I'm going to grab it and apply it. And that could involve doing progressive delivery. That could involve some rules. And it could involve, some other things that we potentially reject back or whatever. But the point of that is you're not building a linear pipeline that handles a whole process. What you're building is a distinct staged approach to building the software and deploying it. And so for DevOps people, that means their job should be easier because they're able to kind of stage things out in such a way that there's less work to do. And for the SREs, there's a lot more insight into the process, and it's a lot easier to drill down into changes to figure out, okay, well, this change was made. What services did that impact? How's that working? So ultimately, it's making the SRE's job easier, and it's making the DevOps person's job easier so that they can actually deploy more software. They can have more confidence in what's happening.
Now let's talk about Codefresh, the real involvement with the GitOps working group that was founded within CNCF. So talk about, first of all, I think it's been 1 or 2 years now since it was last year, right? If I'm not wrong.
Yeah, just end of last year it was launched. So.
The last year was so long.
It's like 10 years.
Yeah, it was like 10 years. So talk about the progress that has been made there. There are like 2 or 3 companies that founded the group, how the group has expanded, and just give us the state of the group.
Yeah, so the GitOps working group started end of 2020. So right now, about 3 or 4 months ago. And it was founded by Codefresh, Weaveworks, AWS, Azure, and GitHub as the founding members. And what we wanted to do is there's been a lot of discussion around GitOps in the last 2 years. Really great people have contributed to it. And what we wanted to do is create a standard. Create an accessible standard that says, this is what GitOps is. This is how you can achieve it. These are examples of GitOps. These are tools that they're going to help you do GitOps. And basically build that out in such a way that the community can rally around. And the response has been enormous. When we launched it at first, we didn't know if anybody was going to show up necessarily. But in our first meeting, I think we had over 80 different companies who showed up who said, we want to be part of this. We want to help build GitOps. We want to help build this standard, and we want to be people that adopt this and use it. So the response from the community has been overwhelming. We meet once a month. We've got we are founded under the CNCF. We're part of the SIG app delivery group, and we are kind of one of the first really groups of our kind within the CNCF. The CNCF usually focuses on tools that are open source projects, and this is a working group and an initiative that is designed to build a standard and actually build the community around that standard. And so the response has been tremendous. People are super engaged. We're currently working on some of the founding documents and some of the initial standards that we think are going to really set the tone and pave the way for the next 2 years of work there. And then we're putting together all of the different assets and tools to help people actually adopt this. We're organizing the evangelism, all those kinds of things.
Dan, thank you so much for joining us today and talk about not only the role of open source program officers, the role of open source, having open source as a core part of the study, but also Gitops. And I look forward to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.